Welcome, everyone, to the third in our live webinar series. Thank you for joining us here at Physicians for Social Responsibility of Pennsylvania. We're very excited to have Stephanie with us to talk about plastics in Pennsylvania and give us some real-life action items to leave this webinar with. For the last 10 years, Stephanie has worked to protect Pennsylvania air, water, and land through organizing and advocacy in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania. I'll hand it over to you.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on what's shaping up to be a really beautiful evening, at least in where I am in Pennsylvania, which is Philadelphia. I'm Stephanie Wein. I'm the Clean Water and Conservation Advocate for Penn Environment. And so if you don't know Penn Environment, we are a statewide, people-powered environmental advocacy group, and we work to protect Pennsylvania's beautiful natural spaces, to fight for folks to have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe, and for real solutions to the climate crisis. And increasingly, we're doing work on the flood of single-use plastics in our society. And so that's where I work and where I focus. And my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the threat of plastics to our environment and public health, not just on the ways we've probably been thinking about it, sort of the macro visible litter and maybe threats to wildlife. I think that's how a lot of us think about plastic pollution. But I'm also going to get into some of the invisible, the less visible ways that plastic threatens our environment and our public health. And then I'm going to close with what we can do about it, because it's no good to catastrophize without giving us our next steps. And I'm just going to see, my slides aren't quite advancing. So I'm just going to figure out what's going on there. Oh, here we go. Okay. Oh, good. They're working. It's not a virtual event if there isn't a slide hiccup at the top. Yeah, and so I think the issue of plastic pollution has been increasingly on people's minds over the last couple of years. I really feel like we've reached this critical point in public awareness. If you asked even Penn Environment members, like the really environmentally inclined general public a few years ago, what the major threats to the health of our planet and to our environment and us as members of that ecological community, obviously people are going to talk about climate change, and then there's a bunch of other stuff, and somewhere down at the bottom is plastic. You know, no one likes litter. Everyone knows it's unsightly and inconvenient, and you know, you don't want to see it on the side of the road, or people don't. I pulled 3 plastic bags out of the bush in front of my house this morning, which I do every morning because I'm on a corner and they like get sucked up in the wind and land in my lilacs. But I don't think it was sort of considered this global crisis. But over just the last few years, I really feel like there's been this, it's broken through the public consciousness in a way it hasn't before. And that's for 2 reasons. One, really good advocacy and organizing by the people that work on these issues, but also because the problem's getting worse and worse. So we're going to talk today about that, and then what to do about it. And I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for some questions, because I know this is always a really good conversation. And so I'm going to walk through how it impacts wildlife, and then also how it impacts our infrastructure, the emerging science of microplastics, and how it connects to the climate crisis. And then, so like I mentioned, one of the reasons people, I think, are more concerned about plastics now is just because there's so much more of it. And if you're thinking that even 10 or even 20 years ago, we didn't have as much, especially single-use plastic packaging floating around as we do now, you're completely right. You're absolutely right. And so even this little hockey stick curve sort of shows the increase in plastic tonnage produced really since the invention of consumer plastics mid 20th century, and we're just going up. And over the last even just 20 years, there's been a 40% increase in the bulk specifically of single-use plastic packaging. And so not only are some hard goods in our life that might have been in the past metal or glass, things like pieces of our appliances and durable house goods, but especially the things we use for 15 minutes but then persist in the environment for 1,000 years. So the obvious things like single-use plastic bags and takeout containers, cutlery and straws, but also when I went to the grocery store as a kid, the cucumbers weren't wrapped in single-use plastic cellophane, and we didn't have fruit already chopped up for us in a little plastic clamshell. And so we're seeing a real movement towards more and more packaging on more and more of our items. And that's where you see a lot of this increase come from. And it's showing up in really ugly ways. I think part of the breakthrough in the public consciousness around the plastics crisis in the last few years was in part because of how visual this crisis is. Sometimes it's really hard to picture water pollution. It's often invisible. Unless it's a really visual smog day, air pollution can be a little hard to visualize. And we all know one of the problems with the climate crisis is it doesn't have a lot of good images. It's sort of this thing that we don't see. But plastic, it's right there. You see it in your neighborhood, and you also see it in really striking photos like these. I'm sure a lot of folks saw the National Geographic photo series that came out a few years ago. And the impact on wildlife is really striking, really profound, and getting worse every year. There's a stat that's shared widely that by 2050, there'll be more plastic than fish in the sea. The math on that is a little questionable, but the sentiment is right. One thing that's a little easier to nail down is that almost every species of seabird, originally it was 2050, now we think it'll be by 2030, is already eating plastic. We see it showing up in our fish and in our marine mammals, and it's harmful in a few ways. One is they just get tangled up on it. I know a lot of us were trained from an early age, we're to cut up the plastic that comes around our six packs, and that's because fish or seabirds get caught in it. There's a lot of ways that fish and birds and mammals can get entangled. And as we have more and more soft plastic and plastic packaging, things like cellophane and saran wrap and bags, those really can entangle a lot of our wildlife. The less visible way, though, that it impacts our wildlife is starvation. And there's some really dramatic images, if you look for them, depending on how tough your stomach is, of whales with their guts just full of plastic. And that's because so often this stuff looks like food. A famous example being that a plastic bag isn't that distinguishable to a sea turtle than a jellyfish. And so often you'll find sick or dying or deceased, especially mammals, but reptiles and larger fish too, washed up on beaches with guts just full of plastic. I think this whale specifically had it was in the hundreds of pounds. And the plastic itself in a macro form, it's not, we'll get into this in a second, it leaches a lot of stuff that's bad for the animal, but the biggest thing it does is it displaces nutritive food. And so if you're a whale or a sea turtle and you're used to eating fish and you start munching down on some really good looking detergent bottles, it's not just that the detergent bottle isn't good for you, is that it takes up the space in your digestive system that should be taken up by nutritional food, leading to starvation. And so we see that at the top of the food chain with really, big visuals like this with plastic water bottles and detergent bottles and plastic toys. But when you go down the food chain, the same thing happens. And so plastic, when it breaks up into little tiny pieces, it's also eaten by the very bottom of the food chain, by zooplankton, who end up with a similar displacement in their gut. And so if you're, a little zooplankton that's used to eating algae and you start picking up tiny microplastics, that's going to have the same effect on you, causing starvation, causing weakening your immune system, weakening your muscle strength, and eventually leading to death. And to think about what that causes in a food chain when you have starvation at the very bottom rung of the food pyramid, and that ripple that could have farther up. So not only are we receiving starvation in our big mammals, our big charismatic whales and sea turtles, we're also seeing it at the bottom of the food chain, at the decidedly less sexy, like zooplankton and really small fish level. And that gets to this emerging threat. We all know how plastic impacts wildlife in ways like this. But then on the micro level, what is it doing to wildlife bodies and by extension our bodies. You know, we are animals not apart from these systems. We're part of a lot of these food chains, and so how does it affect us? And what I'll lead with is that all the emerging science on microplastics is really new. You don't see a lot of papers about microplastics that are more than a few years old, and it's sort of this emerging lens that we can put on the plastics crisis. And so hopefully I can answer any questions that come up about this later. Sometimes the answer is we just don't know. But first, a quick definition is that a microplastic is anything less than 5 millimeters long. So some of them are visible to the naked eye and some of them aren't. And usually microplastics are the result of the breakdown of just normal consumer plastics out in society. And so they usually don't start out that small. Sometimes they do. And a way you usually get down to microplastics is photodegradation. And so that you've probably heard that plastic doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't break down and decompose the way organic matter does, but it photodegrades. So UV light weakens the bonds until it breaks up at a physical level. And if you leave a lawn chair out in your backyard over the winter, you go back out in the spring, it's a different color, the plastic's weaker, it's probably gonna break if you sit on it. That's photodegradation. And especially if you think of the surface of the ocean, that's where you get a lot of the breakdown of macro into microplastics. So plastics themselves can magnify up the food chain. So when they get small enough, you can end up with them passing from the bottom of the food chain all the way up to the top, much like you think of other contaminants in the water, be they heavy metals like mercury or organic compounds like PCBs and DDT. We're beginning to see that there can be accumulation of a really small micro and nanoplastics up the food chain. And that is having probably two different impacts. So one, plastic, while it, in its most pure state can be fairly inert, it has often a lot of additives that have harmful chemical constituents. And so we all know that a lot of plastics have softeners like phthalates, there's parabens, there's various BPAs in that family. There's a lot of different chemicals that can have, we're realizing more and more, impacts on the endocrine system or might be emerging carcinogens. So depending on what's in your plastic, to soften it, to color it, that might be bad to absorb just on its own, whether you're a fish or you're the person eating that fish. But then also microplastics act as a vehicle for environmental contamination to then enter the body. And so even though we banned DDT long ago, even though we're phasing out a lot of persistent compounds like PCBs that harm human health, because we used them for so long and because they're forever chemicals that don't break down, they persist in our environment at low levels that aren't that dangerous unless you're near like a big dump site. But a lot of our waterways have a very low level of DDTs, of DDE, of PCBs, and plastic. It's like oil in water, and so are a lot of those chemicals, and so it essentially acts as a magnet and can magnify. It can attract a lot of the non-polar chemicals that are existing at safe levels in the background of the waterway. And so there's actually been a paper came out just last year that showed DDT levels on a piece of plastic were 100,000 to 1,000,000 times higher than they existed in the background of the water. And so the DDT might not be harmful to a fish that's just swimming through and intaking the water, but if it chomps down on a microplastic that's magnified that DDT, then they're taking a pretty mega dose. And so there's this poison pill effect that happens with microplastics in contaminated environments, even when the contaminants exist at a really low level. And so they're pretty ubiquitous. They have been found in the last year in the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, and they've been found in the top of the Alps. And what's better studied right now is where they are in marine environments, and they're pretty everywhere. And so not only are they bringing along these toxic chemicals with them into the animals that eat them, they're having some other impacts as well that are just starting to be understood. And so a recent paper that I thought was pretty interesting was what it's doing to the oysters that are being encouraged to return in the Chesapeake Bay. They're a huge part of the Bay Cleanup Plan. They're a really important part of Bay Clean Water plans. Shellfish are a big part of the coastal and bay economies. And what we're finding is that microplastics can decrease the algal clearance rate in larvae, which means it takes longer for algae to pass through the digestive system. Essentially, microplastics are constipating our shellfish. And so that's just one little example of how they're having these impacts that we're just starting to understand. Freshwater microplastic distribution is even less well studied, but it's starting to emerge. And so the US Geological Survey found microplastics at all the non-tidal Chesapeake watershed stations. And so that's a bunch of Susquehanna River Basin stations that were tested in the center of the state. Susquehanna University found from 2017 to 2019, 88, then 95, then 100% of fish surveyed over those 3 years in smallmouth bass in Pennsylvania waterways contained microplastics. And then we did our own little citizen science project over the past year, and I can share the link at the end, but a survey of 53 waterways across the Commonwealth. You can see them mapped here, looking for 4 types of microplastics: for film, which is like when plastic bags break down; fibers, those come from the plastic in our clothing and our synthetic clothing; fragments, which are like when a bottle breaks down into little pieces; and then microbeads, which you might remember until a few years ago, there was actually like facial cleansers that had small microplastics in them. And we tested in 100% of the Pennsylvania sites that we sampled, even with very low magnification, very citizen science methodology, we found microplastics in every single place. So they're increasingly widespread. Those are sort of the direct impacts on wildlife and sort of by extension us, on animals, that the microplastics that we're putting out into the environment, or the plastics we're putting out into the environment, are having on our health. It's also having some other impacts on the environmental health at large, including our environmental infrastructure. And so we got to see some of our first hot season flash flooding in Philadelphia over the last week. I hope everyone here had dry basements. I know not everyone did. And so one of the big problems with plastic is it's non-porous. It doesn't let water through. That's often what it's designed to do. It's really good at doing that, including as litter. And so plastic is a huge sort of factor in decreasing the efficiency of stormwater infrastructure, especially urban stormwater infrastructure. And so it clogs up our storm drains and it fills up our rain gardens. It decreases their permeability and it can lead to increased flooding. And so Philadelphia, which is actually a sort of global leader on green infrastructure, they have this really visionary plan, Green Cities, Clean Water, that is supposed to decrease by 8 billion gallons the amount of runoff pollution entering the Delaware River. It's a lot of really cool bioswales and rain gardens and tree plantings are going in all across the city. They've actually found that litter doubles their stormwater costs because of the manpower they have to hire to remove all this plastic waste. And of course, we don't always get to all of it in time. And so we're seeing more flooding, we're seeing an increase in runoff pollution. And as we have more extreme rain events with climate change, we're only going to see that impact get worse. So plastic is having a real burden. It doesn't just look, when you see this on the street corner, it doesn't just look ugly. It's actually really deleterious to our stormwater infrastructure. And it's causing some pretty gnarly runoff problems. It's also, single-use plastics specifically are a big burden on our recycling infrastructure. So our recycling industry, you've probably heard, it's already in trouble. A lot of the foreign markets that were accepting our waste have decided that where a lot of things weren't truly getting recycled, they were sort of getting picked through, a lot of them burnt. They've decided they're closing our doors to our waste. We're sort of stuck with it at home. I think that sort of forces us to deal with the plastic we produce here domestically, but it's really sent shockwaves through the domestic recycling system. And single-use plastics are one of the single greatest impediments that recycling infrastructure runs up against. You can see this little visual in the corner. Those are the common contaminants that are found in our recycling stream, single-use plastic bags being the biggest one, being almost a third of the non-recyclables that end up in the recycling stream. And what happens is, you can see in this picture that things like single-use plastic bags, they get caught around the jaws that grind the recyclable plastics. Kind of like, I have long hair, and this is what happens with my vacuum, is the rollers get stuck. Same thing, single-use plastic bags, the machinery has to be shut down, it has to be manually untangled. And so while our recycling system that we see as this, it's a key part of how we deal with waste and how we keep things out of our landfills, the flood of single-use plastics, of soft single-use plastics, are actually really decreasing the efficiency of those already really burdened systems. So those are some infrastructure implications. And when I say that other countries are closing their borders to the recycling we've been shipping overseas for decades, it's sort of forcing us to deal with the problem at home. This is what I'm talking about, is when I have conversations about, we have so much single-use plastic and it's ending up in our rivers and our oceans, and I go to Harrisburg and I talk to our politicians about it, a common talking point I hear back is, oh, but really the plastic waste comes from China. Really the plastic waste comes from India. This is a problem. This comes from Nigeria. People are blaming other countries. And when you look at the top 10 rivers that plastic waste enters our ocean from, on the face of it, they're not wrong. It comes the Indus River, the Mekong, the Yangtze, but most of that waste is actually coming from Western markets. It's been shipped overseas from the US and from Europe. And so what we're likely going to see over the next few years is a change in where the plastic pollution is actually entering waterways from. But there has been this sort of blame of pushing overseas, when the vast majority of single-use plastic packaging is being created in the US and in Europe and being used in the West. And when you look at the labels of even what comes down the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, they're Western labels, so they're coming from us. And so I think that's an interesting layer to add, because I hear that talking point a lot back, that this is not actually a US problem, but we're very much at the source of it, no matter what river it goes down. And then, well, that's where it goes, but then we also should talk about where it comes from. And this is where I think that Pennsylvania is sort of uniquely threatened in a cradle to grave way by the plastics boom for our environment. And it's because, I mean, every single community from Florida to Alaska, they deal with litter, they deal with trash, they deal with the end pollution that comes from a single-use plastic dependency. But we also deal with it at the source, and we're where it starts. And that's because so much of plastic packaging is increasingly from fracked gas and from the sort of explosion of fossil fuels that have happened across the Marcellus Shale region. The plastic comes from somewhere, and I think that's worth remembering. That's sort of the less visible pollution. This is a map of the over 12,000 wellheads that we already have drilled in Pennsylvania. The orange ones, I got this from Frack Tracker, the orange ones are the ones that have a clean water violation that we know about. And so when we think about the pollution that comes from plastic, it's not just the bag that ends up on the street. It's also, we can connect it to every environmental health hazard that we associate with the shale boom. So whether that's the radioactive wastewater being sent through municipal treatment plants and ending up in rivers like the Susquehanna and the Umiata, whether that's the increased air pollution and the smog comes from gas drilling operations, or just its role in the climate crisis, the methane that escapes and the carbon dioxide that comes from burning it, that all we can tie it into the plastics crisis. And I think this is really important when understanding the profundity of single-use plastic dependency, that it's not just that, when why do we want to take on single-use plastics when there's a climate crisis? And for me, it's that these two things actually are quite intimately linked. And will only be more so. And so this image of this construction site, this is the cracker facility being built in Beaver County outside Pittsburgh. This massive facility that's going to not only be a huge source of climate pollution. I think it's going to be the equivalent of something like 300,000 cars on the road when it's fully operational. But it's the first of 5 that Exxon and Shell want to build in the Ohio Valley region. They really see Western Pennsylvania as the future of plastics manufacturing because of the shale infrastructure there. And so the demand for plastic on the consumer side is sort of stoking the literal fires of plastic production on the western side of Pennsylvania. And the reason being is that when you think of fracked gas, you think of methane, you think of energy, to turn the lights on, natural gas, it's an energy source. Co-occurring in those methane beds is ethane, similar chemical, that until 20 years ago was just sort of flared off. It was sort of burnt off. It was a waste product that you didn't know what to do with when you got the methane that you wanted to use as a power source, to use as natural gas to turn our stoves on. But when over the last 15 years, it's really emerged as a virgin feedstock for single-use plastics manufacturing. And so this little curve shows the increase in ethane production over the last 20 years. And what you see in 2007, 2008, that is when fracking was deregulated. And the fracking boom took off in Pennsylvania and across the Marcellus Shale region. You saw, as we have more methane production, we also have more ethane production. And the gas and oil companies that do this extraction, they in some ways see the writing on the wall that we want to tackle climate change, we want to move off fossil fuels and switch to renewable energy. As they see those policies come down, not yet in Pennsylvania, but in other states and in other countries, the balm to the anxiety for their shareholders about that shift is that, well, we can still make plastics. And so the industry is really looking to plastics as an off-ramp for its product as we move off fossil fuels and shift to clean energy. And so if we're not careful, we're going to end up fracking just as much to make plastics as we were to power our homes, which I think is a really dangerous moment we're in if you're concerned about the impacts of fracking on public health and environmental health. And so that I think is just, and what's also interesting is when you hear about gas pipelines, a lot of the pipelines, like the Mariner East, that are being built across southeastern Pennsylvania, that are being built across the state, a lot of those will move gas not just for energy, but actually for plastics. And so some of the pipeline projects that environmental activists and public health activists are so concerned about, they're actually not necessarily part of our energy infrastructure, they're actually part of our plastics infrastructure, which is, I think, a really sort of interesting frame shift for a lot of folks. And plastic at every single part of it, and I love this image from the Global Alliance for Incinerated Alternatives, I want to give them credit, is where we see climate emissions at every single piece of the plastics life cycle, from the fossil fuel extraction, the energy to create it, the cracking process to turn ethane gas into ethylene feedstock, the manufacture, all the way down to what happens to it at the end of its life. And at the end of its life, it can end up in a landfill. It can break down into a bunch of pieces and end up in fish. But a lot of the times it actually ends up in our air. And so if you're in the Philadelphia region, there's a good chance some of your plastic gets burnt at a Covanta incinerator in Montgomery County or Delaware County. Traditional incineration creates a lot of problems that I'm sure Physicians for Social Responsibility attendees are very familiar with, things like childhood asthma. And they're pretty nasty stuff, like carcinogenic dioxins or particulate matter that can cause severe respiratory ailments. So we've been traditionally concerned about these plastics ending up in an incinerator and becoming air pollution. And a lot of our incinerators that burn plastic waste, they're some of the most frequent violators of their Clean Air Act permits in the state. But then there's a new term emerging, advanced or chemical recycling, that folks may have heard of, which turns plastic back into, the plastics industry likes to say it's a way to turn plastics back into its constituent chemical parts and then create a new plastic item out of it, usually what it ends up doing is turning plastic into fuel to burn in cement kilns or into jet fuel. And so turning our plastic back into a carbon emission creating fuel source. And so a lot of things being sold as advanced or chemical recycling as sort of a circular way to deal with the amount of plastics in our economy actually are, well, it's just another way to create and to burn fossil fuels. A lot of things that are called chemical recycling. So taking something like a styrofoam, breaking it down into its little styrene parts. Theoretically, you could turn that back into a new piece of plastic, but because there's so much cheap virgin material from Western Pennsylvania, from the fracked wellheads entering the market, that's not economical. So instead we just burn it. And so you're seeing a lot of end of life implications for plastic as well. So so that's all the problems with plastic. That's right. That's like a really deep dive into everything that we should be concerned about. It's not just litter, it's not just wildlife, it's climate, it's microplastics, it's endocrine disruption, it's incineration, and it's the fracking boom. It's sort of linked to all these things, like so many environmental issues. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so what do we do about it? And it's when your bathtub is flooding, before you start taking water out, you turn off the tap. You stop producing so much stuff. And so the solutions that we focus on at Penn Environment and that we urge others to focus on is to reduce it at the source. So to stop flooding the market with so much of this stuff in the first place. That certainly is a lot easier than cleaning it up out of our blocks. With microplastics, there isn't an effective way to clean it up. Tackling some of the worst offenders, and then ultimately moving towards producer responsibility. But first, I want to address how we usually think about plastics. And so pretty frequently, I'm asked to speak at a community group or a college or a retirement center about how people can reduce their own plastic footprint, which is a really noble thing to want to do. And it's something I work really hard to do myself. But I usually come back with saying, I don't actually want to talk about reusable water bottles and bringing your own bag. I want to talk about how we need systemic solutions, because the plastic industry and plastic producers have done a really good job of convincing us, much like the climate crisis, that this is about our own footprint. This is about what we buy, what we use, and it isn't about what's being pushed into the market on us by a lot of the big companies creating the products we need to buy to live in modern society. There's really limited, individual consumer power is fairly limited. If you try to live a very low plastic life, it gets really hard. Even if you're bringing your own bottle or bringing your own bag, there's a lot of things you just can't opt out of in society. And the greenest purchase is also what you don't buy. So there's also this cottage industry that's popped up of all the green alternatives that are yet one thing you need to purchase. And so we want to move away from the idea that, bring your reusable bag, use a reusable water bottle, keep doing those things, say no to single use at the grocery store. But at the end, we actually need to spend a lot of that energy focusing on the systemic solutions and having a lot of this not pushed out in the market to us in the first place. Because a lot of folks, even if you're trying really hard, it's already challenging. But then if you're someone who doesn't know how big a problem this is, or just has a lot of other stuff going on, then people's likelihood of sort of voting with their dollar and reducing their own consumption, is just going to go down. So the sort of solutions that we like to look at are political solutions. And as organizers, there's a few ways I'd rather spend my time focusing on political solutions versus convincing my neighbors to not use plastic bags. And one is there's like a clear locus of decision making. You're not trying to convince every single Philadelphian or every single Pennsylvanian or every single Pittsburgher. You just need to convince the 15 people on city council or the majority or the governor's office. There's a clear locus of decision making. And it gets away from the demonization of the individual that I feel like can be a big problem in environmental movements. Policy also levels the playing field. It's really hard for a restaurant to be the one restaurant it's going to choose to go no plastic because their like receiving systems, their purchasing systems aren't set up for that. It might be a little more expensive, and so they're at a competitive disadvantage. So we need policies that level the playing field for us all to make more sustainable choices. And policy victories also beget policy victories. If you can win in one place, you're more likely to win in another and win in another and build momentum that way. And it's a place where citizens have a lot of power. It's very hard to convince Coca-Cola to do something more green theoretically, and there's a lot of barriers, but it is using the democratic process we can get our politicians to force some better policy change. And for example of how momentum, where we've seen momentum play out in terms of plastic reduction policies, California is a really great example. They were the first statewide single-use plastic bag ban. And you know, they're like seen as a liberal state, a progressive state compared to Pennsylvania. There's a lot of good policies there. But that didn't happen overnight. So our sister group, Environment California, worked for 9 years on the California plastic bag ban. They weren't able to pass a bill the first couple of years that they wanted to get one done. And so they went back to the local level and fought city by city, county by county, until over 200 cities and counties had passed single-use plastic bag bans in California. And at that critical mass, when the majority of the state was already living in a town that had local ordinance, then that's when there was the critical mass to actually force the legislature's hand, and we got a statewide ban. And after California, after the ink dried on California's statewide ban, we saw a lot of enthusiasm from other states, and other state and local governments began to follow suit. And we know that policy works. There have been lots of efforts to get people to reduce their single-use plastic consumption on their own for years. It wasn't particularly impactful. California has been on the books so long, we've been able to actually study it and see how well it's worked. There's a 66% drop in plastic bag litter after the first year. And this to me is really exciting because when you look at the trash in the Delaware River, for example, here in Pennsylvania, the most common form of litter is a single-use plastic bag. So if we see that reduction in one of the worst sort of actors, one of the lowest hanging fruit we can most easily live without, and it's this effective, that's really exciting and compelling to me. And now plastic bags are only 1.5% of all litter in California, whereas in Philadelphia, they're almost half of what we're seeing in our waterways. Another example is the microbead-free Waters Act, which happened in the closing years of the Obama administration, a ban on small plastics in cosmetic products. You don't see a lot of them anymore. There aren't more entering our waterways, and it's because that policy works. And so that's why we sort of, versus advocating for the individual, which again, totally, please don't get single-use plastic bags when you can avoid them, but we focus on policy for this reason. And there's been a lot of wins since California came out a few years ago. And so this map is now like a year and a half old. The green is where you have state policy, where there's been steps forward. And since then, Maryland banned polystyrene containers, Virginia just banned them too. And then the orange, those are our steps backwards. So the industry, obviously, they see this as the off-ramp, right? From fossil fuel for energy. They want to create more plastics. So there's also been a lot of effort by the American Chemical Council and the advocates for the plastics industry and the fossil fuel companies to put a lid on that local momentum that ultimately gets you state policy. And that's where we see preemptions. And so that's in orange. Those are the states where there's actually a ban on local single-use plastic bag bans locally. And Pennsylvania is one such state. So, and we've already struggled to frame plastics in Pennsylvania compared to some of our coastal neighbors. It is less, I think, seen a little bit less as a big environmental issue than I grew up in Rhode Island, and I know plastic pollution on our beaches was felt very viscerally. And we're an upstream state, so ultimately a lot of this ends up downstream to the extent that that Baltimore and Maryland they've talked about suing us for how much of our plastic waste flows down the river into the bay. So we're an upstream source, and so we don't always see where it ends up. And we just have really challenging politics. We're a coal, gas, and oil state. We're a fossil fuel state. And so there's some obstacles to overcome politically. But what we started doing was getting, just like in California, the local municipalities that wanted to tackle single-use plastic bags, that had the political will to start banning some of the low-hanging fruit, the worst actors, the single-use bags, the styrofoam, the stuff we can live without tomorrow. This is a great shot from Philadelphia City Council's bag ban vote. And then the legislature responded with an indefinite preemption on all local bans and fees. And so what's happening, so Philadelphia's passed a ban, Westchester, Narberth have passed bans. They got bans on the books when there was a temporary preemption. That preemption's now been extended indefinitely. And so we are suing. We have put together a lawsuit of Philly, Narberth, Westchester, and then a few other municipalities, Lower Merion, and now the city of Pittsburgh, very exciting, has joined the lawsuit, suing the state to get the right of towns back in their hands. So local government that deal with the litter, that deal with the waste, they see it on their streets, they deal with it in their landfills, to give them every tool in the toolbox to start tackling the plastic that we definitely don't need and certainly can live without. And so we're doing two things. We're elevating, there's a lot of effort right now to elevate local opposition. Cities from York to Kutztown to Pittsburgh to the Lehigh County Council are speaking out against this preemption. And so we're going through their own, doing advocacy, and then also we're pursuing it in the courts because we know tomorrow, if the right was returned to municipalities to pass more single-use plastic bag bans or foam bans or limits on plastic straws, there's probably 25 towns I could think of that would move on something really quickly. So the will is there. So we're working to get it back in their hands. So that's like the simple stuff, right? Banning single-use plastic bags, banning foam cups and takeout containers. Those are a huge part of our plastics crisis. So much, 40% of plastics are used once and never again. A huge percentage of our plastic crisis are these single-use containers. That's clearly not the whole picture though. We could ban foam, we could ban bags, we could put straws on request only, we could get rid of plastic utensils, we could mandate that you can't sell fruit chopped up in a little plastic cup, but that won't actually get us to the place of true source reduction. So, I've heard the criticism that these it's like whack-a-mole, where there's sort of these arbitrary bans on this one source. And so I want to share sort of where we want the plastic conversation to go, from working on single-use bans to sort of the vision of the future for a truly circular economy. And that's a policy handle called producer responsibility. And that's the idea that manufacturers and distributors are responsible for the life of their products and packaging after the consumer is through with them. And so it's no longer on the shoulders of the consumer or of our governments, our waste management contracts and our county landfill system to deal with the end result of our plastic packaging addiction. And so producer responsibility is actually not a new concept. And the best example I can think of is batteries. Years ago, it became very clear that because the contents of batteries are so toxic and so difficult to deal with, that the battery industry actually needs to create an end-of-life system for dealing with what they're putting out into the market. And that's been law for a really long time. And there's similar systems in many states for carpeting, for paint, for things that we know are toxic, that the paint industry actually sets aside some of its budget to deal with the leftover paint. There's places to bring your leftover paint and they will deal with it. And so we want to extend producer responsibility to not just toxic batteries and toxic paint. We want to extend it to plastic products and plastic packaging. And the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a federal example of that, a systemic, holistic look at the plastic industry in the US. And not only, it does a bunch of like the simple things, the like bans type stuff. It does a federal bag ban, foam ban, but it also establishes the concept of producer responsibility, which is the thing that I think is really visionary about it and really appealing to a lot of advocates and to a lot of environmental policy experts. And even with the changes we've seen in the federal government over the last year, that policy as it is now probably won't pass this session. But what's exciting is that a lot of states are actually taking on this and doing their own legislation. And so we got really close to, actually, I should have added California. Something came really close like this to passing in California and Washington state. There's a bill in New York that's seen as really good for establishing producer responsibility in the state. We are going to have a bill introduced in Pennsylvania soon. But so in the short term, we want to get rid of sort of the low-hanging fruit, the bags we use for 15 minutes, but stay in our environment for 1,000 years. But long term, we want to put into place policies that ultimately put the responsibility on the producer and not on the consumer. And because if you're a plastic bottle company and you have to deal with something at the end of its life, you're going to choose materials that are more recyclable, or you're going to choose packaging that actually is compostable. You're gonna make different design choices that will make it easier to deal with the end of life product versus a lot of the plastic we have around our houses, which has a billion different types. It's really hard to recycle. It has all different chemical components. Different choices will be made if producer responsibility is the law. So ultimately, that's where we need to shift towards. And those conversations, especially over the last 2 years, have started in a really productive way. So that's where we gotta go. And so those are sort of the places that I think are most exciting to engage in terms of taking action is, so one, obviously, I mean, like, you probably know how to reduce your own plastic footprint as much as you can, as is reasonable in your own house. But what we really need to do is be working on getting the resting control of plastic policy back into the hands of our municipalities so they can pass real substantive policy. And we need to support the policies ultimately that get to a circular economy, and don't leave us with sort of this sea of plastic that we have to sift through every time we purchase anything or throw anything away. So I wanted to save the last 15 minutes for questions and for discussion, but I also want folks to know how to keep in touch with everything that Penn Environment is doing on this front. And so one, here's my contact info. Feel free to reach out, and then also feel free to follow Penn Environment on social media, on our Twitter, on our Instagram, and on our Facebook. It's at Penn Environment on all those channels. We also have a mobile action network. So for example, when they're going to try to extend preemption again, we're sure, in the coming months. And we have a text network that'll actually let people know, so they can reach out to their representative, they can reach out to their state senator and tell them to vote against extending preemption. We also want folks to contact their members of Congress and tell them to support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. Most of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation is not co-sponsoring this act yet. And so we'd love to see more federal support from our representatives in DC. And then finally, we love organizing. We can't do all this alone. And so if you want to do more on plastics advocacy, please get in touch with our volunteer organizers, or me directly, and I'll get in touch with them. But there's bit.ly link at the bottom, bit.ly/envirovol. Enviro.vol, nope, just Envirovol, is where you can connect with our volunteer efforts, and get plugged in to trainings on how to do media work around plastics, on how to contact your elected officials, and ways to really feel like you're sort of doing more than just bringing your reusable bag. And so that's the content I had. And now I'd love if people have questions. Or maybe I should leave that slide up longer.
We do actually have a couple of comments in the chat. but there is a specific question. Could you do a cracking 101 spiel? What is the relationship of cracking and fracking to plastic production? How is Penn Environment working towards stopping the increase and scaling back current activity in those industries?
That's a great question. And so I am not an organic chemist. I am mostly an organizer. But the really the 10,000 foot view is that what co-occurs in the methane, what co-occurs in a natural gas bed, there's the methane that we were already drilling for to use as an energy source. And co-occurring with the methane in the gas bed is ethane, which used to just be discarded, like it was a waste product. But then we can actually transform, and the process is called cracking, and the organic chemistry is a little complicated, but the ethane gas can be turned into ethylene, and the ethylene is a sort of the feedstock that's used in the creation of thousands of different plastic products. And so once a plant has transformed chemically the ethane into ethylene, it's then turned into nurdles, NURDLES, nurdles. They're these tiny plastic pellets that are then, they can be melted down and put into molds. They can have softeners or hardeners or colors added to them, and then they can be transformed into all the various plastic products that like populate our lives. And so it goes from ethane to ethylene to plastic nurdles to, you know, your water bottles and your pencils and your electronics cases. And so the ways that, and so one of the sort of plastic policies that I didn't touch on, this is a really great question, is that not only should we be trying to like ban single-use plastic bags, we should also be fighting attempts that are made to subsidize more plants like this. And so last summer, a $600 million tax incentive was passed through the legislature by a very thin margin to, like, as a giveaway to the petrochemical industry and to the fossil fuel industry. And it was sort of seen as like, this is an energy bailout, but it actually gave a lot of money. It was going to benefit plastic manufacturers. And so we should be fighting not only the plastic that's entering the market, but we should be, when we're talking about tax policy, when we're talking about what we incentivize in terms of manufacture, and just the fact how much money we give as a state to oil and gas, that's also plastics policy. And so when we in the budget right now are fighting to make our case that we should not be increasing any subsidies to the oil and gas industry, that's not just good climate policy, it's also good plastics policy, which I think that gets to, and then also like everything we already want to do to regulate fracking. So we want to increase setbacks so you can drill in fewer places. We want to keep it out of our state parks and forests. We want to increase regulatory oversight. We want more money for the Department of Environmental Protection so it can enforce what laws we do have on the books. So all the ways that all the policies you would go to when you're trying to rein in the fracking boom, and then plus just like subsidize clean energy. So increase the renewable energy portfolio standard, increase support for solar and wind, increase energy efficiency, increase support for electric vehicles. So everything that comes under good climate policy also helps move away from the infrastructure we would need to lean heavily into plastics. And so on one hand, that actually seems really overwhelming. It's like, oh gosh, we have to subsidize solar, we have to stop subsidizing oil and gas. But it's also like, that actually means there's a lot of opportunities. So there's a lot of places that we can go after the plastics boom, specifically here in Pennsylvania, because it is so local. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. There was another question. It says, at least half of ocean plastic waste is not consumer plastics, but fishing gear. Sea Shepherd 2021. Shouldn't we also be advocating for policies that call for a reduction or ban on fishing?
Totally. Absolutely. Yes. We just do less work on that. That is also really important. That said, I think plastic fishing line, it's very durable. and it's very visible. And when you're looking at macroplastics, a lot of that is fishing equipment. But a lot of the microplastics that sort of exist as a film within the aquatic environment, those are sort of the post-consumer plastics. And so there's also some discussion about actually the like total amount. Is it really 50%? They're actually, the consumer products could be way more than we recognize because of how quickly they break down, because they're like the flimsier ones. And when you think of like the Pacific Garbage Patch being this island of trash twice the size of Texas in the Pacific that we've all heard about, it's not quite a hard island. It's more like this soup. And a lot of that is the small breakdown of consumer microplastics. But there are policies that are often negotiated internationally that call for the fishing industry to be more accountable in the materials it uses. A lot of that's good. One of the problems is that in the US, some of that policy gets tied up in bad plastics policy. The Save Our Seas Act 2.0 that had some oversight for the fishing industry and its lines and its waste. We're really concerned about that becoming law last year under the Trump administration, because it also exempted, like it said the US would not comply with international regulations prohibiting the shipping of plastic waste to developing countries. So there was a lot of bad in there too, but there definitely needs to be policies that address fishing plastic waste for sure. Obviously, that's not what's causing the plastic pollution in our freshwater, but it's a huge marine problem.
Thank you so much. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to jot it in the chat before we wrap up, but I would like to be respectful of everyone's time, especially on this beautiful evening. Thank you again, Stephanie, for all of the information that you shared. If anyone would like to watch this recording again, it will be available on our Facebook page. Otherwise, go out and enjoy nature. Pick up some plastic along the way if you see any. And thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks everyone for coming and spending your Wednesday evening with me. And I'm just gonna share while people head out, I'm gonna share that slide of ways to stay in touch with Penn Environment and the work that we do. And if people have further questions, feel free to reach out. We love to hear from folks, and especially PSR.
Thank you.